avec notre deuxième speaker de l'après-midi. So, our second speaker is Jörg Dollmann. He's a postdoctoral researcher at the Mannheim Center for European Social Research at the University of Mannheim and the head of the research data center DeZIM at the German Center for Integration and Migration Research in Berlin. His research focuses on social and ethnic inequalities in education, with a particular interest in how institutional factors affect educational outcomes. He also studies the process of second language acquisition among migrant population. More recently, he has expanded his research to include pattern of solidarity during the Russian war in Ukraine. His work relies on quantitative methods to provide insights into migration, integration, and educational attainment. So our pleasure to have Jörg with us. The floor is yours. Same rules, 25 minutes. Yes. I mean, you can speak more again.
Yeah, thank you, Antoine, for having me, and thanks for the kind words. Yeah, so I thought so maybe short before Christmas, some bit pathetic words from disparity to promise. I try to show a new perspective on immigrant integration, thanks, in European education. And now I got the right arrow to press the right arrow. Okay, starting with the problem. And I call it problem because that's what it is in Europe, that it's always or often a rather problem-focused perspective on the educational success of children of immigrants. So we find usually lower performance in grades and test results. We also find a lower educational attainment. And to bring the most important explanation for this already on slide 1 is this can really be explained in most cases completely, or at least to a really large degree, in socioeconomic status and resources differences. So meaning that it has something to do with the migration history of immigrants to Europe, being recruited as guest workers in many cases from the lower end of the SES distribution, and yet this is just these are just the lasting effects, so to say. So this is the main explanation that we find usually when we study educational differences. But yeah, and this problem-focused perspective gained additional momentum with the refugee migration to Europe, starting in 2015 from Syria, and also further on 2022, early 20s, with the war in Ukraine, many people from Ukraine fleeing the country. And yeah, and there this problem-focused momentum gained, as I said, additional additional attention. Besides this standard explanation that we have on socioeconomic differences to explain these differences in educational outcomes, there are other, some kind of sometimes a bit strange explanations, but being strange, they are advocated quite vehemently. And as an example here is a book by a really famous German politician already 15 years ago, but with, I guess, that book, this debate started to increase, I would say. And he argues that there is some kind of unwillingness among immigrants and their children, and they are less inclined to value education. And he wrote this famous, really got a famous book, Germany Abolishes Itself, meaning abolishing by immigrants, so to say. And another, and here explicitly not a strange explanation, but another important explanation is discrimination. Many argue, okay, discrimination is a key factor behind differences in educational outcomes, and be it through teachers, so individual discrimination, or through structural conditions. And as structural conditions, there is, of course, when you look at the European context and the comparison between countries, that the educational systems may play a role in educational attainment, so that some immigrants do better in comprehensive systems without an early tracking, so to say, and as compared to educational systems where there is a really early selection. You just mentioned it after the 4th grade, for example, in Germany, so with the age of 10, so which is really early. Yeah, and the questions coming out of this is, so is this all true, what they say? So are immigrants really unwilling or less inclined to value education? So is discrimination really a driving force behind ethnic inequalities? And do educational systems matter really that much, especially when you look at them in the long run, right? Yeah, and yeah, to answer these questions, I will present some work that I have done on my own and also work from others, and I will try to present some kind of overview here. Okay, coming to this unwillingness argument, so it's really, yeah, it's a bit, I can't walk a bit without this microphone here. You can just take it off there, but then it's like a music singer at a concert. Yeah. So giving this clear empirical evidence, it's a bit strange that you really talk about this narrative of unwillingness, right? So when we look at studies focusing on aspirations, for example, there's so clear evidence that immigrants aim high for educational success and even sometimes outperform their native counterparts, especially when you compare students of the same socioeconomic background, right? So they're aiming higher than, so when you look at low SES students, where many immigrant students are located in this strata, so they outperform their native counterparts with the same socioeconomic background, right? So there is so much evidence about that, that yeah, it's really strange that this narrative persists somehow. But some argue, okay, but these are maybe just irrelevant attitudes or so. But when you look at actions, so real actions, then you see the same picture. And actions are here, for example, educational choices, right? So when you look at this transition after the fourth grade, so to say, but also transitions in comprehensive systems at age 16 or something, then you see that students also outperform their native counterparts once you control for socioeconomic background, right? So they are more likely to aim for the more ambitious tracks. So sometimes already cross, it depends a bit on the transition that you're looking at, but usually when you control for SES, at latest then they outperform them. And really this is a unique picture, and you see here a lot of references. This applies to, I guess, all European countries where such studies are made. You find this pattern, right? And in these few studies where you can look at these transitions and also have information about aspirations, you see that actually these aspirations are the driving force behind these ambitious choices, right? So it's not so much else is going on there, but really it's the aspirations that are the driving force behind that. Yeah, so for that, I would say it's a quite clear picture, this unwillingness, that it doesn't make any sense at all. When we talk about discrimination, it makes sense, first of all, to get some kind of a definition of discrimination. And I rely here on this Quillian definition, that racial discrimination, or in our case then in Europe, ethnic discrimination, is the difference between the treatment that a target group actually receives and the treatment they would have received, or that they would receive if they were not members of the target group, but were otherwise the same, right? So the only difference is, okay, ethnicity or race, and the rest is the same. Are they treated differently in, for example, grading or track recommendations? And that is also, what is mainly, what is often the dependent variable, right? So these grades and track recommendations. And so, and many studies do that, for example, with observational data. So meaning, do children of specific ethnic backgrounds receive the same grades or the same track recommendations once you control for objective measures of achievement, for example, in PISA studies or so, and once you control also for the social background. So if everything else is the same, do they get the same grades and the same recommendations? And there are also some experimental approaches where teachers or students that want to become teachers are presented essays where everything else, so the same essay, but only the name of the pupil is manipulated, right? So once there is a German sounding name, for example, on it, and once there is a Turkish sounding name on it. So these are the two different types where many studies try to capture these discrimination tendencies, individual discrimination tendencies of the teacher. So there is a recent systematic overview of 27 studies focusing on quantitative studies, and they include, Batruch and colleagues, they include observational as well as experimental studies, as I've shown before that. And what we find here is a rather robust thing regarding SES. So meaning that low SES students, regardless of their ethnicity, they are graded usually worse at given achievement levels, and they also are less likely to receive recommendations for more ambitious track, right? And this is really an extremely consistent and also not very small effect, right? So this is really, so it's not around zero, but it's really a large effect, I would say. But what they find is rather inconclusive findings regarding ethnicity, right? So some studies report discrimination. So after controlling for all these background variables, there is some kind of ethnic palette left. Some find no effects, and some find even positive effects. So that at given performance levels and at given SES immigrant students are graded better or receive more ambitious track recommendations, for example. So yeah, given that, you could say, okay, maybe it's not that of a problem, or at least not a systematic problem. But what we also have is we have a lot of studies dealing, and Karen said it already, with perceived discrimination. So you can't say there is nothing, because many immigrant students perceive discrimination, and I have here some examples of studies, especially asking for such experiences. One at the DeZIM, this National Discrimination and Racism Monitor, and here, yeah, 3/3 of all of the respondents report some kind of racism or discrimination, and of those, it's about 2/3 being in school. So meaning that at least you can imagine that some of this discrimination actually was done in or was perceived in schools. Yeah. So then that's a bit a contradiction to what we have found before. And the question is how to resolve this possible explanation, to resolve this possible contradiction. And yeah, I'm trying to structure this a bit in a new publication. It's maybe a bit over-optimistic, but in the last round of a revise, resubmit, and most probably gets published next year. And I would argue that this contradiction is maybe not that big or that contradictory, because, for example, Karen, you also presented it with the PISA data, that there are some kind of expectation effects. So we don't find discrimination in grades, but maybe we find already discrimination in achievement development. And if teachers, they hold specific expectations towards specific groups, and if these expectations are lower, then people or pupils will gain less achievement over time, right? And if you then control for achievement in these studies with grades as a dependent variable, you don't find everything can be explained away, but achievement is already the subject of discrimination, for example. However, there are studies looking then on this effect on ethnic gaps, so to say, of these expectation effects, and it seems that there is nothing there to be, that this doesn't really matter for ethnic gaps, right? Another argument I bring forward is that it could be resilience. We have seen these high motivation aspirations among immigrant children, and this could be an effect, of course, that you can overcome discrimination and still be good in school, yeah, even though that you feel untreated, you feel treated unfairly by your teacher, for example. And another thing that I bring forward is this compensating effects of teachers. And yeah, you have to keep in mind that who gets a teacher. When you look at surveys among teachers, you see that they're usually more left-wing, liberal, green voters. So with a more immigrant-friendly picture and immigration-friendly picture. So you can ask, okay, are these really the usual suspects when you talk about discrimination? And there is a nice study in Denmark talking about compensating discrimination, and they have really, yeah, nice data because they have some kind of measures of performance, once by the teacher and once by a nationally standardized test. And both are aimed to measure the same thing, right? So by law even, so they really should be congruent. And yeah, for the teacher, they have, of course, the name. They can discriminate racially, for example, or by ethnic status. But of course, in the nationally standardized test, there is no possibility because you don't know who did this test, right? So it's very objective. And what you see here when you look at these pictures, and I really have to make the pop star here. Okay, when you look at this picture here, you see here, that's the first generation, the second generation, and yeah, here is the teacher grade, and here's the test grade, and here is the bias. And you see here at the teacher grade, so this is a non-migrant advantage, so a disadvantage for immigrants. So they have the first generation is doing even worse than the second generation, but they are already doing worse than the majority population, right? The zero is the difference to the majority population. So you see a clear disadvantage, but when you look at the test grades, so without knowing the name, so to say, of the student, these results are even worse, right? And when you simply subtract those from each other, then you see some kind of a immigrant advantage, right? So the test scores are that bad, and they are graded only that bad by the teacher, meaning that, yeah, there is some kind of compensating effect, and that teachers are rather heterogeneous groups can be seen by this figure here. So just ignore this huge bar, this huge curve, because this is gender, but just look at these two lines here. You see here the 0 point of no bias, so to say. And you see how this really, there are some people, some teachers, there's a negative bias, and for even more, there is a positive bias, right? So grading them better than they would have been in the test, leading, and that is a bit more on that side, leading to this positive effect. Oops, wrong. Leading to this positive effect that we have seen here, right? So this is the immigrant advantage, so to say. So I think, yeah, this is a really nice study showing that teachers, they are not heterogeneous. Some do discriminate, some do not, and some do simply the opposite. So, and have some kind of positive discrimination. Just heard that term in the break. And oops, I think, yeah, it's, yeah, it's has something. Okay, and coming to the educational systems, do they really matter that much for ethnic inequalities, especially in the long run? And I'm also drawing on this SILS4EU study that Karen already presented, where we compare, Belgium is not included here, but with the 4 main countries in SILS4EU, where we compare immigrant integration in 4 countries, Germany, Netherlands, Sweden, and England. And you see here the educational systems and how they differ. So here is the age of the student, and yeah, you simply see that rather early after the 4th grade in Germany, pupils get separated into an academic track and 2 more vocational tracks. And the same holds true for the Netherlands, where the change is a bit later, but also rather early. But you see also here these 2 more comprehensive systems of England and Sweden. But the good thing is for this study that at the age of 16, all should be in some kind of a an academic track or in a more vocational track. And the good thing also is that pupils in Germany can change from a more vocational track afterwards into this academic track, and so to say, catch up. So if they are located already here, and then maybe due to their high ambitions, catch up a bit and go to the gymnasium. So because these educational systems, they are maybe more open than it's supposed to be. And what we look in this study, what we look at in this study is there a difference at age 16 in the participation rates in an academic track or in a non-academic track in all the 4 countries? And when you look at that, you see already gross that there are no difference in the case of Germany or slight advantages for immigrant students, so they're more likely to be in this academic track. And when you control then for composition differences, for example, socioeconomic background, but also the achievement, which is also mainly driven by socioeconomic differences, then you see here on this final model that overall, in all 4 countries, we have really similar participation rates in the more ambitious tracks for immigrants, regardless of the educational system, right? So regardless if you're located in these 2 more stratified systems as compared to these 2 more comprehensive systems, right? So, and I would say, okay, at least in the long run, these educational systems, they do not matter that much, but of course, always do. But of course, when you look here, you see huge disparities to the negative of immigrants. For example, they are less likely to be in the academic track, but they seem to be able to catch up in the long run after these vocational tracks and change them to an academic track. So, right. So, and there is a study supporting somehow this finding. I will have a bit more, I guess, but they look at social inequalities and in different European countries, and also look how these different types of secondary education shape these shape the pathways of different social groups. And their main message, and I really like that, is advantage finds its way. So regardless how different the systems are, so students with a privileged background here, as I said, it's about social inequalities, will find their way to navigate through the most prestigious positions. And I would argue we see a similar picture with respect to ethnic minority status, because they, with their higher ambitions, they follow really this choice perspective of high SES students. They have the achievement perspective, so to say, of the low SES students in Germany or in Europe, but they have the choice perspective, which really mirrors that of the high SES students. So coming to a first conclusion, so as I said, ethnic inequality is a special case of social inequality, I would say, and the relative importance of specific ethnic factors like discrimination or some kind of low aspirations is rather, this is not a case, or very small either. And instead, I would draw a more optimistic picture, saying that, these immigrant children, they are really striving for upward mobility, and whenever it's possible, they try to have the highest educational degree. And as you have seen in this comparative picture, they seem to really be able to do that. But then there are some arguing, are these positive choices really a good thing? Because they, of course, they go there with lower achievement levels and from poorer social backgrounds, therefore they have higher dropout rates. And some say, this could lead then to health problems. This is some kind of an optimism track, because when they then have to leave and start vocational training, then they are delayed by a year or 2. Or this may also reinforce statistical employer discrimination. And that was, all these messages was a reason to start another project where we focus on that on a more longitudinal way. And you see here natives and immigrants next to each other. And you see here, these are just participation rates in grade 9. So in Germany, it's only Germany, grade 9. So before this transition, or before the end of vocational schooling, so to say. So where we have students being located in the lower degree, in the lower tracks or in the higher tracks. And these are the lower tracks, these are the higher tracks, the attendance rates, these are the natives, as I said. And you see about 1/3 are on an upper secondary track, 2/3 of natives are in the vocational track, but these figures are a bit higher for immigrants here. And what you see here is this optimistic picture. So they make this choice after these lower vocational tracks upward to the upper secondary track, this gray one. And what you also see is that there is, in fact, a more pessimistic picture of people being more likely with an immigrant background dropping out, right? So they are dropping out more likely. And we would still argue, so, and when you look at the deltas, besides these 3 different steps, so at the end, this is if they make it then to a degree, so to say. And yeah, you see here, so the delta is 10% point, then it diminishes up to 4, and then it's 10 again. So if you just compare these figures with one each other, and yeah, you could say, okay, nothing happened that much with respect to the gaps. But when you look further, then you see without these optimistic choices, only about more than 20% would have made it to an upper secondary degree. And once you have these upward mobility people, it gets to 1/3, right? And so we would still argue there is something positive behind these optimistic choices. But the problem is that the others advocating that it's not so a good thing say, and it's again, some kind, it's a question of the perspective. They say, yeah, but we are concerned about them, about these 8% going down. We are concerned about them. And we would say, yeah, but we value those. And they say, yeah, we are concerned about them. And therefore, coming to the final slides, Antoine. So we thought, okay, we should look at that more comprehensively. And why we did a study with Swedish register data and asked in a simulation study, what would be if we persuade immigrant children to behave like natives, so not so optimistically, and what would happen to this completion gap if we put some kind of on a grade limit, so numerus clausus, so to say. So you're not allowed to go to an academic track once you have a achievement of that and that GPA also, right? And what I will show here is just the results of this second simulation. And just look at the left-hand side here. You see here, these are actual completion rates in the Swedish educational system. And the good thing is we have here data from a complete cohort, and we can just follow them from the beginning of upper secondary education, so to say, up to completion. And we look here only at completion rate, right? So these are actual completion rates. These are the natural sciences tracks. These are the social sciences, other academic tracks, and these are the vocational tracks, right? And here it's ordered like these are the most prestigious ones, the natural sciences, and the vocational are the less prestigious ones, right? And you see here again, this immigrant optimism thing, they tend to avoid the vocational tracks, but are more likely to be found even in completion at the natural science track, which is the most prestigious one, right? So this is a picture of immigrant optimism that they choose for the more demanding tracks. If we introduce now a grade limit that we don't allow them with poor grades to go on a natural science track, so to say, and we have a different grade limits for these different tracks, then this is the simulated completion rate, right? So of course we know how successful are they with a given grade at a specific track. Therefore we can simulate these completion rates, and what we see is that of course in all these more prestigious ones, the completion rates diminishes because people who are not allowed to go there following a grade limit, they are pushed to these less demanding vocational tracks. And here, of course, these completion rates increase for these vocational tracks. But what is important here is, so these are the completion, and what is missing to 100% is the dropout rate. And you see that for both groups, both is a bit pushed forward. So it's now here more nearer than to 80%, and here, yeah, maybe almost 85 or 90%. But the interesting thing is that this gap is not affected. So when you introduce a grade limit and allow immigrant children not to pursue the high ambitious, the gap is not reduced, and the completion gap at all is also diminished only by 3% points, right? So it doesn't, there's not so much that this helps, but the problem is, you see it here among immigrant children, the simulated completion rate for the vocational track, it goes up by 150%. So it's not that much for native students, but for immigrant students, is of course also 50% is a lot. But here it's 150%, which are pushed under this scenario of a grade limit to vocational tracking, right? So, and therefore we think that yeah, this wouldn't help that much, and therefore we are really confident that these ambitions are actually a driving force to reduce ethnic inequalities. And this was again the wrong one. Whoever invented that is really yeah, and so coming to my personal final conclusion, the integration of immigrants and adolescents with an immigrant background, it works quite well. What we can expect, given the specific individual migration biography of the families, for example. And I would say there is in fact no reason for a pessimistic narrative being from the one side. So this unwillingness, but also from the discrimination side, I would also say that it's not this driving force if it's really important at all. So thanks for your attention, and yeah, that's it.
Talk to the Q&A and listen to the microphone.
Hello, I'm a scholar from Ukraine, and that's why I can, it's even not a question, it's just my guess about the explanations of one of those phenomena you mentioned, like outperforming and aspiration to higher education. Because I can only talk about Ukrainian group because I don't know the data about other ethnicities. I know that among Ukrainian war immigrants, 75, if not more, % of mostly it's women and children, and those women, more than 75% of them have higher education. So if those kids are from educated families with relative ambitions. So it can be the explanation, because this high level of education in the structure doesn't really reflect the whole German society or even whole Ukrainian society. So just selective group, and because of that, can be such a level.
Yeah, sure. Sure, I think that's a specific case, but we also have other groups in Europe and in Germany that are coming from less privileged groups. So, for example, the former guest workers, they are recruited from unskilled workers, so to say, and this is long lasting. And here among Turks, for example, Turkish immigrants, you find really also these high ambitions, given their socioeconomic background. So it doesn't matter that much. And I think it's important to compare them always to natives from the same social background. I think that's the important thing, if they outperform or not. And once you do that, they outperform them. So it's not necessarily that you find it when you look at aspirations overall and compare them to the native population, then sometimes you don't find disadvantage, but once you control for socioeconomic status, then you find it. And I think that's the relevant reference group you have to look at. Yeah.
And I think that you mentioned resilience is another reason. I think it's for all. If They already got in Germany, and German education is valued, highly valued. They try to do the schooling.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you for the presentation. Really interesting. I'm still trying to wrap my head around all the data you presented. I was wondering if you had looked into the influence of time in the country, because the data you presented with the dropouts and the different tracks, I didn't get if they were all children born from parents of immigrants. Okay, because I was wondering.
No, this exactly is this is more due to data scarcity. It's more. These are all immigrant children, actually first and second generation.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I had a question whether time in the country had some effect, because so we know that it takes time to know the system, the educational system, and to know which tracks work or not. And so I was wondering if there were some differences between the first generation and the second generation, and then time spent in the country for the first generation, and also whether this is linked in a way to parents' influence or ability to make choices and knowledge. So I was wondering if there was some influence of the parents, and that, especially when we know that parental support is a factor of achievement and grade, and so maybe something to do with the dropout rate. So I was just curious about that.
Okay, so starting with the first question, so I, in another paper I'm not presenting here, I looked at generational differences, and actually it is the case that the first generation, they don't show these optimistic transition rates. So because they're, as you say, maybe they're not so familiar with the system, but it's really there for the second generation. There it's really huge. And interestingly, the third generation, they get assimilated or whatever to the German society. You don't find this ambitious transitions. It's really, especially the second generation. I would say the first generation, they are not able to, because they don't know the system that much. So you find it a bit, but not that much. The second is really strong on that. And the third, then it declines again. And maybe in the fourth generation, you maybe don't find a different at all. And regarding how much the teachers can influence the decision, for example. So I looked at also in another paper at the first transition in Germany after the fourth grade, if these recommendations are binding, the teacher recommendations, if they are binding or not binding. And there you find really a strange or a nice picture, I would say, maybe strange. So it's some kind of a zero-sum game. So if you look at ethnic inequalities with this binding recommendation, when the teachers say this child has to go to a gymnasium because the grade, the GPA is that and that, so this means binding, then ethnic inequalities are increased, because then the leeway for the immigrants, for their high ambitions, is not there anymore, because with their poor achievement, they are not allowed to go to the more ambitious tracks. And the contradictory finding is that SES inequalities, they are with a binding track recommendation, they're also reduced, because so that's what would you like, right? So reducing social inequalities, and so therefore many talk about these binding recommendations, because then the high SES parents, lawyers and whatsoever can't bring their stupid child on a academic track because it's not good enough. But with the binding recommendation, you increase ethnic inequalities because the ambitions of the immigrants can't play out anymore. So that's so it really matters how it is organized. But the interesting thing is, this was the wrong one. So that's all about this transition here, right? Where this binding is introduced in some federal states in Germany, but not in all. But here it's more open. So, and that's where they can catch up. Even those having to go to a Realschule or to Hauptschule, which are the lower tracks, they can go there without, it's not so much difficult, I would say. And there is really this possibility to catch up, and therefore we find these findings that I've just presented, that when you look at the participation levels compared to this, then you almost find no differences or even advantages, because they are able to catch up. In the long run, this then again turns a bit again on the negative side, because you have seen this in this longitudinal study better, because they're more likely to drop out then. Yeah.
Thank you, Emmanuel from University of Sherbrooke, represent. Thank you for your presentation. It was really amazing and quite surprising for me. I don't know if you have the answer of my question, but it seems I'm not wrong that migrant students have positive perspectives of their future at school, right? And it is in some ways counterintuitive. Yeah, counterintuitive of what we are thinking. That it's what explain, in your opinion, this misperception. There's a gap, in my opinion, between what we think it is and what it seems to be with your data, right?
Yeah, but I think so. On the one hand, one explanation is, I guess, that this has changed over time. So when you looked at 15 years ago or so at completion rates, I think the differences were much larger. So I think, and this got better, so to say, and yeah, and when you look at transitions, or when you look at participation levels here on that side, or at the transition, or also on achievement, you also find these differences. It's not that there are no differences there, right? But given the background of the students, they are doing their best. And as I said, especially in the long run, so maybe differences that are persistent here. But when you look at the final occupation they attain, and we do that with a new data set in Germany, where we combine the SILS for You study only on Germany with the National Educational Panel study to have more case numbers. And when you look there at the final occupation they attain, you don't find that much of a difference with respect to earnings, with respect to the prestige of the job, and also with respect to graduation levels. So it's almost so that we think, oh God, maybe the data is wrong, but it's really, there is not so much. And I think this long-term perspective is important. Maybe they need some more years than their native counterparts, but in the long run, they're able to catch up. And yeah, especially when we look at the prestige on an ISCAT scale, for example, or on income, there is no difference. So maybe there are quantitatively located in different jobs, but these are similar prestigious and offer similar earnings. And also when you look at the final attained degree in schooling, yeah, they're also doing not that bad, maybe a bit delayed, but it comes. And I think these two things, so that 15 years ago it was worse, but now it's getting a bit better, but also this long-term perspective, because many look only at a snapshot like here, for example, and then they see these differences. Of course, they are there. So I'm not here to say that there are no differences, for example, in the PISA tests or so. We find these, but we can explain this with differences in socioeconomic background. So, and I think just saying that there is no specific ethnic thing into it, I think that is important. And yeah, that leads me a bit to this optimistic conclusion. And also these findings in the long run that, yeah, maybe it turns out good mostly. So yeah, you shaking a bit the head, but yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah, at least for Germany, we don't find it anymore that much. So.
Hi, thank you very much. The difference that you had posted there with the two different test assessments from the teachers' evaluations and the standardized testing really struck me. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about why we see that difference. My apologies, but that's not directly in the area you're researching. But to me, it could be, I mean, on the one, like all tests have some bias and discrimination baked into them from the immigrant perspective. There's language differences, which is the obvious one, but there could also be differences in cultural meaning, like baked into the test. So one reading could be that the test is more difficult for those people. It could also be maybe the teachers are doing something a little bit differently, like maybe they're a naive view, they're qualitatively evaluating those types of differences that are not captured by the standardized testing. But it's just curious to me that if two tests are supposed to be measuring the same type of ability and we see this type of difference, there's discrimination in the test. I'm just wondering why that might be. Do you have any data to speak on where we see this coming from? Is there a way that one testing can correct? If so?
Yeah, that's of course a difficult question because it's not my study and also not our data, and so therefore I can only speculate why this could be. But I think what is striking, I totally agree with your objections. But what is striking, I would say, is this rather huge bandwidth of differences in bias, right? So that you sometimes so then I wouldn't expect that heterogeneity in the results, because here you really have features that really have a strong negative bias, but here you have a strong positive bias. And I wonder, okay, if it's all about the difference in the how difficult the test is, would we see such a picture? I'm not sure, actually. And therefore, I think it's really more about the heterogeneity of the teachers, so that some of them are maybe more discriminatory than others, or trying to help students. So I have also, so it's anecdotal, but so when you sometimes talk to teachers, they say, yeah, okay, he's this guy with Turkish background, he's maybe not so good, but would he speak the German language that well as another, he would outperform them. And I honor this. Therefore, I give him a bit better grade, because he comes from with poorer starting conditions, and therefore I try to push him a bit more. And I think this is something that you can see here on the right-hand side, right? So where they say, okay, for a Turkish student, this is really great what he does. So, yeah. But this is only anecdotal. But
we have time for one final question. If not, I will ask it. No, I'm not sure. It's a question. Is there a question in the front? No. That's what I thought. Yeah, that's what I thought. So, quick question, two parts. So the first one is, maybe it's my capacity for attention that is not good enough, but I hear a lot of the role about aspirations and resilience in your talk. I hear less about the role of institutional openness and flexibility. You do have it, to me, at the end, but it seems you put less emphasis, or maybe it's me. But to me, it was very striking at the end when you were showing the experiments of what if they were behaving as non-immigrants. But the right-hand side part of it, to me, was very powerful about what if the institutions, if I understood correctly, were not as open and flexible. And there, the effects were gigantic, as far as I'm concerned. So to me, it seems, yes, it's a question of resilience, but it really, really is important. It seemed more so than I understood from your talk about the role of institutional openness and flexibility. So that's the first part I would like to hear you, just make sure I it's me or whatever.
no.
The other is, I know you take into account in some of these studies about the socioeconomic background of migrants, but beyond that, do we know if some groups of migrants struggle more? And here I mean, like some refugees, for instance, or, you know, depending on how they got there, if beyond socioeconomic factors that makes an effect. And maybe a third, based on what Valerian was talking about. I guess it's a frivolous questions, but do we know, have you ever seen any study that compares, you know, the educational attainment based on the rank order in the family? So, you know, we failed with the first one, but when we get to the third or the fourth one, we understood how it works, you know? So, yeah, exactly. So, and it's really frivolous questions, but if that were the case, I know at least in Canada, migrants' families are much larger. So if that could be an explanation, that could be an explanation for the greater achievement, which is, you know, they have many. So at the end of the day, one of them got it right, you know, but I guess, yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, for the last one, I can just say I know some studies, but I can't tell by heart the results. I can send you over something, but there are some studies in the German context going on doing that on birth rank order. Coming to the first one, that is the how much an institution could matter. That's the good thing that's a good thing for a simulation. We can introduce a really hard GPA. We can really introduce a hard GPA border, so to say, or a grade limit, and that you can do, of course, in a simulation. But and that's also something that we write on in our conclusion. In the case of Sweden, it was unthinkable of having something like that, such a grade limit, because in such an open, comprehensive school system, it's unthinkable to introduce something like that. And even in school systems where it is not so uncommon to do that, for example, in the German school system, you don't find it that hard, given, okay, 2.5, you're out, better than 2.5, you're in. So even in these binding school systems that I've just talked about, there is leeway for high SES students, for example, and all others, even via the law that they try in front of the court to bring their child on a more demanding track, so to say. I wouldn't say this is the case for immigrant students, but for high SES students without an immigrant background, this is really the case. And I think these results, maybe on the one hand, they are a bit maybe exaggerated. So it's the findings is too high. So what we find there, because it's just a thought experiment. Okay, what would happen if we do that? But on the other hand, maybe it's not overestimated effect, because you would move children wanting to study natural science, and then you say, okay, you have to go to vocational track. I wonder if their ambition to succeed there is that high, because, oh, I don't want to go there. And therefore, maybe therefore these effects are not overestimated, so to say. So I agree with you, but we should keep in mind that this is really a thought experiment and has nothing to do with empirical reality. So of course, these effects are really, but we wanted to show that when you only look at those here that the other researchers do, and you only look at those, but if they wouldn't have gone there in the first place, then they wouldn't drop out there. But they assume that, okay, when they would have been here, they would have achieved or completed this track, so to say, but it's not given. And we tried that with the simulation, showing that, okay, you have to look there more holistic, and then you see this, it's not so important if you prevent them from going up, even if they drop down, because there's not so much of a difference as I've shown in this Swedish study. And the second question was about group differences. Of course, this is extremely interesting, but refugees, for example, in the German context, I think we now have the possibility to study them in more detail, because now we have a relevant number of them. And before 2015, it was not so much the case. So for quantitative studies to differentiate between those, and I think this could, of course, be could make a difference. But when you look, for example, at specific groups, for example, the Turkish population, which is the most stigmatized group in Germany, and those also doing worst together with Italians, to our surprise, they're doing worst in the educational system. These are those with the highest ambitions. And for example, students with a Russian background, for example, they are not doing worse than the native population, but they're not as ambitious as the Turks, for example. They are really sticking out, and it seems like, okay, I want to have really a better life than my parents have, for example. And there you see these differences. And I thought maybe that was it. Okay.
So we've reached the end of our time, so we will resume in 10 minutes. But before we leave, a big round of applause. The super rich talk. Thank you very much. So final speaker in 10 minutes. So about intergenerational trends. Yeah, so see you in 10 minutes.